Guitar Bizarre fan invades isolated recording session. John Lennon's reaction left the police in disbelief. London, March 1970. Tittenhurst Park. Ascot. John Lennon's sprawling Georgian estate, purchased in 1969, was meant to be a sanctuary, a place of quiet, a place where the relentless, suffocating glare of public life could be held at bay, a place where, in the aftermath of the Beatles' bitter end, John could finally find space to create without the constant intrusion of the world's demands. The recording studio, built into a wing of the main house, was his inner sanctum. A state-of-the-art facility, it was where he was crafting John Lennon/Plastic Ono Band, an album of raw, primal honesty that was as much therapy as it was music. The sessions were intensely private. Only John, Yoko, a small, trusted band, and a handful of engineers were permitted inside. No press, no fans, no outside world. Tonight, the studio was alive with the low hum of equipment and the specific, focused energy of creation. John was working on Mother, a devastatingly honest song about his childhood abandonment. The track was stripped bare, just John's voice, Ringo Starr's drums, and Klaus Voormann's bass. Every take was an emotional excavation. John was in the vocal booth, headphones on, his face contorted with the effort of channeling decades of pain into sound. Yoko sat beside Jeff Emmerich in the control room, listening with the quiet intensity of someone who understood precisely the cost of what John was doing. The estate itself was secured. A long, winding driveway led to a main gate, usually manned by security. The grounds were extensive, surrounded by high walls and dense foliage. It was, by all accounts, impenetrable, which was why the sudden, insistent banging on the studio door cut through the focused silence like a gunshot. Emmerich and Yoko exchanged a startled glance. Nobody ever approached the studio door directly. Not during a session, not without prior arrangement. The banging came again, louder, more frantic. John, still in the vocal booth, pulled off his headphones, his expression one of irritation. The fragile emotional space he had built for the song had been shattered. Emmerich walked to the door, his hand hesitating on the knob. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice tight. A muffled, almost incoherent shout came from the other side. Something about the message and the truth. Yoko stood up, her eyes narrowed. "Don't open it, Jeff," she said, her voice low. "Call security." But before Emmerich could react, the banging intensified. A crash, the sound of splintering wood. The studio door, a heavy, solid oak barrier, buckled inward, and a man stumbled into the room. He was disheveled, wild-eyed, dressed in clothes that looked like they had been slept in for weeks. His hair was matted, his face streaked with dirt. In his hand, he clutched a worn, leather-bound book. He looked around the studio, his gaze sweeping over the expensive equipment, the famous faces, the sacred space of creation. Then his eyes locked onto John Lennon, still standing in the vocal booth, staring at him with a mixture of shock and something else. Something cold and unreadable. "John," the man gasped, his voice hoarse, breathless. "I have to tell you. The message. It's time." What John Lennon did next, in the face of this bizarre, terrifying intrusion, would leave the police, when they finally arrived, completely baffled. And it would leave everyone else in the room with a chilling glimpse into the mind of a man who had learned, through years of relentless public intrusion, to respond to the impossible with a logic entirely his own. To understand the impact of this intrusion, you have to understand what Tittenhurst Park represented to John Lennon in 1970. It was a fortress, a deliberate attempt to build a physical barrier against the chaos that had consumed his life. The Beatles' fame had been a relentless, 24-hour-a-day assault on his privacy. Every moment, every word, every gesture had been public property. The breakup had only intensified the scrutiny, turning his personal life into a global soap opera. Tittenhurst was meant to be different. A place where he could be John. Not John Lennon of the Beatles. Just John. With Yoko. With his music. With the difficult, necessary work of figuring out who he was without the band that had defined him for a decade. The security measures were extensive. A full-time security team. Motion sensors. Guard dogs. The perimeter was regularly patrolled. The idea that someone could breach it, let alone smash through the studio door, was unthinkable. But the man who stood in the studio, breathing heavily, clutching his book, had done precisely the unthinkable. His name was Arthur Finch. He was 38 years old, a former theology student who had suffered a series of mental health crises in the late 1960s. He had become convinced that John Lennon was a prophet, a vessel for a divine message that only Arthur could fully understand and help him deliver to the world. Arthur had been camping in the woods surrounding Tittenhurst for 3 days. He had studied the patrol routes, the blind spots in the security system. He had subsisted on scavenged food and a relentless, almost feverish conviction that he was on a sacred mission. His book was a heavily annotated copy of the Bible, filled with his own cryptic notes and highlighted passages that he believed contained the secret code to John Lennon's true purpose. He believed that John's lyrics, particularly those from the White Album and the early solo material, were prophecies that only he, Arthur, could correctly interpret. He had tried to deliver his message before. Weeks earlier, he had attempted to scale the main gate, shouting John's name. He had been apprehended by security, questioned by the police, and released with a warning. He had been told, in no uncertain terms, to stay away from Tittenhurst Park. But Arthur Finch was not a man who listened to warnings when he believed he was on a divine mission. The rejection had only intensified his conviction. It was a test, a trial. He had to try harder. He had to be more determined. He had spent the last 24 hours without sleep, fueled by adrenaline and the certainty of his purpose. He had found a weak point in the perimeter wall, a section where the ivy was particularly thick, concealing a loose brick. He had squeezed through, navigated the dense woods, and found his way to the studio wing, drawn by the faint sound of music. He had knocked. He had shouted. And when no one answered, his conviction had told him that the door itself was a barrier to the truth, a barrier that needed to be broken. Now he stood in the room, panting, his eyes fixed on John Lennon, the man who held the key to the universe, the man who needed to hear his message. John, still in the vocal booth, watched him. His face was a mask. No fear, no anger, just a profound, unsettling stillness. Emmerich, meanwhile, was already on the phone to security, his voice low and urgent. Yoko stood beside him, her hand gripping his arm, her eyes never leaving Arthur Finch. Ringo and Klaus, who had been in the live room, had frozen, their instruments still in their hands. The sanctuary had been breached. The walls had failed. And in the heart of his private world, John Lennon was face to face with the specific, terrifying consequence of his own fame. Hey, before we continue with this incredible story, I need to give you an important warning. Many subscribers have reported that YouTube has removed their subscriptions without notice. Just take a quick look at the red button below to make sure you're still subscribed to the channel. I don't want you to miss any of the exclusive content that's coming up. And while you're there, leave that powerful like. That helps me a lot with the algorithm. Oh, and tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? I love getting to know every amazing person who is part of this community. Your participation makes all the difference. Let's interact. Arthur Finch took a step forward, his eyes still locked on John. They don't understand, John, he whispered, his voice cracking with emotion. They don't understand the signs, the numbers, the hidden meanings in your songs. John stepped out of the vocal booth. Slowly, deliberately, he walked toward Arthur, his movements calm, unhurried. Emmerich, still on the phone, watched in disbelief. Yoko tensed, ready to intervene. Ringo and Klaus exchanged worried glances. This was not how you handled an intruder. You waited for security. You kept your distance. But John Lennon had never done things by the book. He stopped a few feet from Arthur. He looked at the man's wild eyes, his disheveled appearance, the worn Bible clutched in his hand. What message? John asked, his voice low, completely devoid of emotion. Arthur blinked, startled by the direct question. He had expected anger, resistance, disbelief. Not this calm, almost curious inquiry. The message of the new world, Arthur stammered, opening his Bible to a heavily marked page. The prophecies, your songs. Revolution 9. It's all there. The coming of the new age. The end of the old ways. He tried to hand the book to John. John didn't take it. He simply looked at it. And what does it say? Arthur began to speak, a torrent of words pouring out. Cryptic interpretations of Beatles lyrics, mixed with biblical verses, numerological calculations, and a fervent belief that John was destined to lead humanity into a new spiritual era. He spoke of John's role as a messianic figure, of Yoko as a divine muse, of the hidden truths embedded in every chord and every lyric. He spoke for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes. John listened, without interruption, without judgment. His face remained a mask of profound, unsettling stillness. He simply stood there, absorbing every word, every frantic gesture, every desperate plea for recognition. Emmerich, who had finished his call to security, watched in growing bewilderment. The police were on their way. They would be here in minutes. But John was engaging this man, not dismissing him, not placating him, engaging him. Yoko, usually the most protective of John, remained silent, her eyes fixed on the bizarre tableau unfolding before her. She knew John's fascination with the fringes, with the outsiders, with the people who saw the world differently. But this was different. This was dangerous. Arthur finally ran out of breath. He stood there, panting, his eyes still wide with fervent conviction, waiting for John's response. John looked at him for a long moment. Then he spoke. So, John said, his voice still low, still calm. You've broken into my house, smashed my studio door, interrupted my work, all to tell me that I'm a prophet and my songs are prophecies. Arthur nodded eagerly. Yes, John, It's the truth. John took a step closer. His voice remained calm, but something in its quality shifted. A subtle, almost imperceptible hardening. And what if I told you, John said, that my songs are just songs? That I'm just a man? That the only message I have is the one I put on the record, and it's not a secret code for you to decipher? Arthur's face fell. The fervent conviction in his eyes wavered. No, John, you don't understand. They're not just songs. They're more. They're not more, John said. His voice was still quiet, but now it carried the weight of absolute, unyielding certainty. They're exactly what they are. And if you think they're more, then you're not listening to the songs. You're listening to yourself. The studio door burst open again. This time, it was the Tittenhurst security team. Two burly men, followed by two uniformed police officers, their faces grim, their hands on their batons. They had arrived. And they found John Lennon, the most famous musician in the world, standing calmly in his breached sanctuary, engaged in a quiet, unsettling dialogue with a wild-eyed intruder, while everyone else in the room watched in stunned silence. The police officers, Sergeant Davies and Constable Miller, were accustomed to dealing with celebrity incidents, drunken brawls, paparazzi intrusions, overzealous fans, but nothing in their experience had prepared them for this. They found John Lennon, completely calm, standing face to face with the intruder. No struggle, no shouting, just a quiet, intense conversation. Mr. Lennon, Sergeant Davies said, his voice authoritative, trying to assert control over a situation that felt profoundly out of control. Are you all right? Has this man harmed you? John turned to the officers. His gaze was direct, unblinking. I'm fine, Sergeant, he said. He hasn't harmed me. He's just a bit confused. Arthur Finch, seeing the police, suddenly became agitated. He began shouting about the message, about the truth, about John's prophecies. The security guards moved to restrain him. Hold on, John said. His voice cut through Arthur's shouts, through the security guards' movements. Don't touch him. Everyone froze. The security guards looked at John, then at the police. The police looked at John, then at Arthur. Mr. Lennon, Sergeant Davies said, his patience wearing thin. This man has broken into your property. He's damaged your door. He's clearly a danger to himself and potentially to others. We need to take him into custody. John walked over to a chair and sat down. He looked at Arthur, who was now trembling, his eyes darting between John and the officers. He's not a danger, John said. He's just lost. And he thinks my songs are going to save him. He looked at the police officers. What are you going to do with him? Sergeant Davies sighed. We'll take him to the station. Process him for breaking and entering. Assess his mental state. He'll likely be held for observation. John nodded slowly. And then what? He'll be released. And he'll find another way to get the message to me. Or to someone else. Because he believes it. He genuinely believes it. He looked at Arthur again. Arthur had stopped shouting. He was watching John with a desperate, pleading expression. He's not a criminal, Sergeant, John said. He's a fan who's taken things a bit too far. And he needs help. Not a jail cell. The police officers exchanged glances. This was highly irregular. Victims of a home invasion did not usually advocate for the mental health of their assailants. Mr. Lennon, Constable Miller said, we appreciate your concern, but this is a police matter. We have procedures to follow. Procedures, John scoffed. A flicker of his old sarcasm returned. Procedures are for people who don't know what else to do. I'm telling you what to do. He stood up again. He walked over to Arthur Finch, who was now being held gently by the security guards. Arthur, John said, his voice softer now. Listen to me. My songs are not prophecies. They're just songs. They're about my life, my feelings, my questions. They're not a map to the future. They're just a record of the past. Arthur looked at him, his eyes still wide, but now with a glimmer of something else. Confusion, doubt, the first crack in his fervent conviction. But, Revolution 9. Arthur stammered. Is a sound collage, John interrupted gently. It's a piece of abstract art. It's not a secret code. It's just noise. Beautiful noise, maybe, but just noise. He looked at the police officers. I'm not pressing charges. Sergeant Davies' jaw dropped. Mr. Lennon, he broke your door. He invaded your home. That's a serious offense. And I'm not pressing charges, John repeated. His voice was firm, unyielding. I want him to get help, not to be punished for being lost. The police were in disbelief. They had never encountered a victim like this. A victim who refused to be a victim. A victim who saw the humanity in his assailant and chose compassion over retribution. The standoff in Studio 2 lasted another 10 minutes. Sergeant Davies argued. Constable Miller tried to explain procedure. The security guards looked increasingly uncomfortable, caught between their duty to protect John Lennon and John Lennon's explicit instruction to treat the intruder with care. But John was unyielding. His cold, unreadable demeanor had transformed into something else. A quiet, determined resolve. The same resolve that had allowed him to strip bare his emotions in Mother, to confront his own pain with unflinching honesty. He looked at Arthur Finch, who was now slumped in the security guard's grasp, the fervent light in his eyes almost extinguished, replaced by a profound weariness. "Arthur," John said, his voice cutting through the police's arguments. "Do you want help?" Arthur looked up, startled. "Help?" "Yes," John said. "Real help. Not a jail cell. Not a padded room. Someone to talk to. Someone to help you sort out what's real and what's just in your head." Arthur was silent for a long moment. The frantic energy had drained out of him. He looked like a man who had run a marathon and finally collapsed at the finish line. I don't know," Arthur whispered. "I'll pay for it," John said. "I'll arrange it. A good doctor. A quiet place. No police. No charges. Just help." Sergeant Davies finally threw up his hands in exasperation. "Mr. Lennon, this is highly irregular. We cannot simply release a man who has committed a crime without charges." "You can if the victim doesn't press them," John countered, his voice sharp. "And I'm the victim. And I'm telling you, I'm not pressing them." He looked at Arthur again. "What do you say, Arthur? Do you want to keep chasing prophecies? Or do you want to try and find some peace?" Arthur looked at John, then at the worn Bible in his hand, then at the smashed studio door. The reality of his situation, the absurdity of his mission, seemed to finally settle over him. He nodded slowly. I want peace, John." John turned to the police officers. "There you have it, Sergeant. He wants help, and I'm offering it. No charges. No fuss. Just help." Sergeant Davies, defeated, finally conceded. "Very well, Mr. Lennon. But this is on your head. If he causes any further trouble, you'll be responsible." "I'll take responsibility," John said. His voice was calm, unwavering. The police, still in disbelief, began to gather their things. They had come to Tittenhurst Park expecting a straightforward arrest. They were leaving with a story they would tell for the rest of their careers, a story about the most famous man in the world choosing compassion over retribution and leaving them utterly baffled by his logic. As the police and security prepared to escort Arthur Finch off the property, not to a jail cell, but to a waiting car that would take him to a private clinic John had already arranged, John walked over to the smashed studio door. He looked at the splintered wood, the broken frame, the physical manifestation of the breach. Then he turned back to Emmerich. "Right then, Jeff," John said, his voice returning to its usual professional tone. "Let's get this door fixed. And then let's get back to Mother. I think I've found the right scream for the middle eight." The incident at Tittenhurst Park was never reported in the press. The police, respecting John's wishes and the unusual circumstances, kept it off the official record. The security team was sworn to silence. Jeff Emmerich and Yoko Ono, understanding the delicate nature of the situation, never spoke of it publicly. It remained a private story, a whisper among the few who were there, a testament to a side of John Lennon that the public rarely saw. Arthur Finch, under John's patronage, spent the next 2 years in a private clinic, receiving therapy and support. He gradually recovered, his fervent convictions about John Lennon's messianic role slowly receding, replaced by a more grounded understanding of his own mental health challenges. He never returned to Tittenhurst Park. He never tried to contact John Lennon again, but he carried with him the memory of that night, the memory of a man who, when faced with an intruder who had broken his sanctuary, chose compassion instead of anger. In a rare interview given in 1995, Arthur Finch, now a quiet, unassuming man working as a librarian in a small town, spoke about that night for the first time. "I was completely lost," he said. "I genuinely believed I was on a divine mission. I thought John Lennon was a prophet. I thought his songs were prophecies." He paused, and he didn't laugh at me. He didn't get angry. He just listened. And then he told me the truth, that his songs were just songs, that he was just a man, and that I needed help. He looked out the window of the library. "He saved my life," Arthur said quietly, "not by believing my delusions, but by seeing the person underneath them, and by offering me a way back to reality when everyone else would have just locked me away." John Lennon never spoke of Arthur Finch, not publicly, not even to close friends. It was a private act of compassion, a moment of profound humanity that he chose to keep separate from his public persona. But those who were there that night, particularly Jeff Emmerich, noticed a subtle shift in John's approach to his work after the incident. A deeper understanding of the fragility of the human mind, a renewed commitment to the idea that his music, however raw and honest, had a responsibility to connect with people, not just to provoke them. Mother, the song he was working on that night, became one of the most powerful tracks on Plastic Ono Band. The scream in the middle eight, which he found after Arthur Finch was escorted away, was imbued with a new layer of meaning. Not just personal pain, but the universal cry of someone lost and searching for truth. The smashed studio door was repaired. The security at Tittenhurst Park was tightened even further. But the memory of the breach, and John's extraordinary response to it, lingered in the air of Studio 2. A reminder that even in the most secure of sanctuaries, the outside world could find a way in. And that sometimes, The most unexpected responses to that intrusion were the most profoundly human. New York City, December 8, 1980. John Lennon was murdered. The world mourned. The public narratives of his life were cemented: the Beatle, the activist, the peace campaigner, the difficult genius. But the private stories, the moments of quiet humanity that never made it into the headlines, remained in the memories of the few who witnessed them. The story of Arthur Finch was one such story, a testament to a side of John Lennon that defied easy categorization. A man who, when faced with a bizarre and terrifying intrusion, chose compassion over retribution, understanding over judgment. Tittenhurst Park was sold by John and Yoko in 1973. The studio, where so much raw, honest music had been made, was eventually dismantled. The physical space that had been breached by Arthur Finch no longer exists in its original form. But the memory of that night, the quiet, unsettling dialogue between a rock star and a lost soul, remains. It is a story that challenges the conventional narrative of celebrity. It asks us to consider what happens when the walls between public figure and private individual collapse, not with violence, but with a desperate plea for connection. And it asks us to consider John Lennon, not just as the icon, the legend, the voice of a generation, but as a man who, when confronted with the most bizarre and unsettling manifestation of his own fame, chose to see the humanity in his assailant. He could have been angry. He could have been afraid. He could have had Arthur Finch arrested, prosecuted, and locked away. The police expected it. The security guards were prepared for it. The world would have understood it. But John Lennon chose a different path. He chose to listen. He chose to engage. He chose to offer help. And in doing so, he left the police in disbelief. He left everyone in the room with a chilling glimpse into the profound, unsettling logic of his own compassion. Arthur Finch, the man who broke into John Lennon's sanctuary, found peace because John Lennon refused to see him as a threat. He saw him as a person, a lost person, a person who needed help. And that, perhaps, is the most revolutionary act of all. Not the songs, not the protests, not the grand statements, but the quiet, uncelebrated choice to see the humanity in someone who has broken your door, invaded your space, and shattered your peace. And to offer them help, even when the world expects you to offer them retribution. The police report from that night is filed away somewhere in London, marked "No charges pressed," a blank space, where a crime should have been, and somewhere else, in the memory of a man who once believed John Lennon was a prophet, there is the echo of a quiet voice, saying something true. My songs are just songs. I'm just a man, and you need help. 3 sentences, delivered without anger, without judgment, and the silence of a room, understanding that the most profound response to a desperate plea for meaning is sometimes simply the truth and the offer of a hand. The end. If this story about the radical compassion of John Lennon, the quiet power of choosing understanding over retribution, and the extraordinary effect of seeing the humanity in someone who has wronged you moved you, subscribe and leave that powerful like below. Share this with someone who needs to hear that sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply to offer help instead of judgment. What moment in your life taught you the difference between justice and compassion? Tell us in the comments below.